Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing marvellously well. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, what are you doing, my love? Asked Mrs. Spicer, entering the kitchen, as she observed her husband's shadowy silhouette, looking through the glass window that overlooked the street and front yard of their property. His binoculars were steadily pinned on the prepossessing large residential 1920s property, happily nestled on the opposite side of the street. The kitchen clock on the wall displayed the time as 9:30 a.m. in the morning. Was it really that late? She wondered. Mrs. Spicer knew she'd overslept this morning, but as the coldness seeped into their bedroom, it was a struggle to get up in the mornings and to abandon her lovely warm bed. The wood-burning stove in their kitchen had given the room a toasty warm feeling, which was why it was her favourite room in the entire house. It was as snug as a bug on a cold winter's morning, such as this, even though theoretically winter was a while away yet, but it may as well have been winter, as the days were breathing out icy cold air, like a freezing cold air-conditioning unit, as if the past summer had all but been a wistful pipe dream. Luckily Evelyn Spicer's husband Errol would get up very early in the morning to stoke up the dying embers of the previous night's fire in the cast-iron stove, to get it rekindled again, and it had made their open-plan kitchen the quintessential heart of the house. Most houses in their neighbourhood had radiators, underfloor heating, and more modern energy-efficient strategies to keep their houses warm during the winter months. But Evelyn's husband Errol liked only using radiators in their bedroom and bathroom en suite, but in the living room and the kitchen he preferred to use the old-fashioned methods of heating, incorporating the full benefits of burning wood and coal together, which meant real fires were the order of the day during the winter months in the Spicer household, so that plumes of billowing white smoke would float away in the air from above their chimney. It would seem on the wind you could smell the pleasing scent of wood smoke that would nostalgically remind you of campfires on pleasing summer holidays. The kitchen this morning embodied that sumptuously rosy warm glow. She could see the red flames of the wood burner wrestle mightily with the wood and coal, so that the flames danced merrily in the grate, and the very sight of this inviting warmth lifted her spirits exponentially, as just looking at it made her feel infinitely warmer. It was late October. The trees were frenziedly dropping their leaves, like old boring clothes that they had long since tired of wearing. Evelyn knew that it would be late November or early December when the cold finally would really begin in earnest, and in no time at all the trees would be bedecked in resplendent glistening garments of white snow. The couple's two mixed-breed dogs, Chester and Wallaby, both looked like a cross between a multitude of dog breeds, but there was definitely Labrador and Husky in both of them somewhere, even though they were not remotely related, but looked uncannily alike. They were wisely curled up near the wood-burning stove, their heads popped up, their ears perked forward as Evelyn entered the kitchen, hugging her red tartan dressing-gown close to her chest. Wallaby got up to greet her with his tail wagging furiously, but Chester, who was getting on in years and was rather on the lazy side, did not fancy getting up from his comfortable position lying on the floor, especially with a touch of arthritis in his legs that grew increasingly problematic when the weather was cold. She couldn't blame him for that, for there was an unenviable biting chill in the air this morning, which had meant that Evelyn was sorely tempted to stay in bed the whole morning. But there were things that needed to be done around the house, and Evelyn lived her life according to a structured, disciplined routine, and that was the way she liked it. Evelyn had been directed to the kitchen by an invisible tug that she couldn't even physically see, but she knew what it was. She needed a cup of coffee this morning. Her throat was as parched as a dry, barren desert, and her energy levels were plummeting fast as she let out another exhausted yawn. Ostensibly after her first cup of coffee, she would eagerly prepare breakfast. Her husband liked to start the day with a bowl of traditional jungle oats porridge, followed by scrambled eggs on toast served with crispy bacon. There was a time when Evelyn Spicer had abhorred the taste of coffee, but one cold winter's day, when they had been snowed in the house for a few days in early February, she had been dying for something warm to drink. But the couple had completely run out of tea, so she begrudgingly drank coffee for a couple of days, and surprise, surprise, she found that she actually liked it. These days she couldn't get the day started without that quintessential cup of coffee. She had realized that she must be addicted to the stuff. It was probably the caffeine. She wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or not, as she was forever listening to debates going on the radio about whether coffee was good or bad for you. She hung on to the belief that it was definitely good for you, because even if it wasn't, she'd be loath to give it up. She smiled happily when she observed there was some freshly brewed coffee from the coffee machine, nestling on the stand her husband had prepared. Its smoky, nutty aroma had left her salivating. "What are you doing, love?" She repeated the question, wondering privately if her husband Errol needed a hearing aid or something, for he failed to answer her direct question. But then again she could see he was up to his old tricks. It was so typical of the man, she thought. Errol was as sharp and as shrewd as a fox. He probably hadn't even noticed her coming into the kitchen. He seemed caught up in the moment, almost as if suspended in some kind of trance-like state. His fingers were trembling as he stared through the binoculars, like a fervent bird-watcher that was focusing on a rare bird. She almost wished she could snatch his binoculars away from him in haste, as her husband of late had almost become obsessed with spying on the neighbours, which Evelyn thought was an extremely distasteful thing to do. But it was like he just couldn't help himself. He was addicted to watching the world go by through his binoculars. She did not know how to discourage this antisocial behaviour. Errol Spicer was in his early 80s, but looked to be in his late 60s. He was reasonably fit and robust in health. She called him her lovable silver rogue, as when he turned 30, his black hair became grey overnight. She had liked the rather debonair, stylish look on him. He was lucky. His hair was thick and lustrous, as it had been all those years ago when they'd first met, whereas Evelyn's hair was on the thin, wispy side and needed to be fluffed up rather artfully, using a hairbrush and hairspray, in order to give it the appearance that it was a lot thicker than it actually was. She envied her husband's thick locks. They should have been hers by rights. Wasn't it men that were supposed to have thinning, receding hairlines, not women? These days there was a road map of lions on Errol's face that accentuated his advancing age, but Evelyn loved every one of those interesting lines, for in her opinion it meant that her husband had lived a rich, full and vibrant life, as every line etched in his crinkled, weathered-looking skin told a story of its own. Evelyn frowned as she observed her husband with a close scrutiny, almost as if looking at him through different eyes that belonged to that of a stranger. She could not help but think that if anyone on their street were to spot her nosy husband, watching their comings and goings in their neighbourhood through his binoculars, they might believe he was some kind of a perv, and the thought made Evelyn recoil. She knew Errol was no perv, but he was extremely inquisitive. Even when he was a little boy, Evelyn had been told by Errol's own mother that he'd get his nose into everything. Errol would find all the hiding places where I would stash the presents. Your husband was absolutely incorrigible, Evelyn dear. That boy had to know absolutely everything. So he always knew what he was getting for Christmas and birthdays. It seemed at that age he was absolutely impossible. It also seemed that at his age that he was now, that in no way had his childlike enthusiasm and curiosity dulled. It had not been tamed by any manner of means. Sometimes Evelyn thought her husband had been in the wrong profession, as a corporate auditor, which had meant he'd travelled a lot for business back in the day, and Evelyn had been left at home for weeks at a time to care for the couple's 2 boys. Evelyn wondered if her husband would have been better suited to becoming a private investigator. He was a natural snoop, and if you're great at spying on people, you might as well make a living out of it. Errol was always telling her that he was just good at neighbourhood watch and stuff like that, and that the people of Sunnyvale Close should be incredibly happy that he was paying attentions to the comings and goings in the street. Evelyn did not agree with this. She thought it was extremely rude to intrude on other people's business and in their privacy, but if anyone were to notice anything untoward going on in their street, she would be the first to admit it would be her husband Errol that would know what was going on. That man had the memory of an elephant. He could remember old phone numbers, addresses, and birthdays going back for 20 long years, and even the names of everybody that attended kindergarten with him, which was something that completely confounded Evelyn, who could barely remember her own cell phone number, or even the date and the time of year it actually was. It was only the scenery that gave it all away. Errol found things out about people long before they were actually standard knowledge. He had this magical way of extracting information out of people. Moreover, he noticed things, picked up on body language. One Sunday morning, for example, her husband had been staring at Mr. and Mrs. Bullaway, who were seated on the pew opposite them when they attended church for the Sunday morning service. The couple was known by the community as the quintessential perfect couple that was an example of a godly marriage. Evelyn had been so embarrassed as Errol had continuously cast his steely gaze over the Bullaways. Mrs. Bullaway was suddenly made fully aware of Errol's surreptitious stares. She became increasingly uncomfortable and rather self-conscious, almost as if she thought she must have spilt her boiled egg she'd eaten that morning down the front of her dress or something. Evelyn had tried to surreptitiously throttle her husband with the back of the Bible, hoping nobody had seen her. She sat next to him in the pew and had whispered in his ear, "Errol, for God's sake, stop staring at the Bullaways. Mrs. Bullaway knows you're looking at her. It's rude to stare. You're embarrassing me, Errol." When they had returned home from church that morning, Errol had said matter-of-factly, "Mr. and Mrs. Bullaway are getting a divorce." "What?" said Evelyn, raising a brow, staring at her husband incredulously. Did he think he was some kind of soothsayer, blurting out something like this, for no rhyme or reason, she wondered. "Where did you get that idea from, Errol? Everyone knows the Bullaways are a perfectly contented married couple, an example to the community. But an uncomfortable one at that, with the way you were gawking at them all morning in church. Honestly, Errol, you're incorrigible, love. What am I going to do with you?" she had said, nudging him teasingly. "That's exactly what the Bullaways want you to think," Errol had retorted. "They want everyone to believe they're happily married. But it's all a very clever act. They're not. They're absolutely miserable with each other. I could read their body language very, very clearly. Mrs. Bullaway snubbed her husband when he tried to hold her hand in church, and it was so subtle it would have been very easy to miss. But I saw it all. The scaffolding that once held that seemingly incorruptible relationship together is falling apart at the seams and disintegrating, even as I speak. You mark my words, Evelyn, love. In a month's time, those two will be filing for divorce." "Oh, for goodness sake, Errol, listen to yourself. Don't be so dramatic. They were probably just having a Barney in church. You're reading too much into it, you know. Couples fight all the time, don't they? But it doesn't mean their marriages are about to implode." Errol had turned around to her and said stiffly, "I told you, Evelyn. Why don't you listen to me? The Bullaways are getting divorced. Watch this space." And with that, he retreated from the kitchen to resume his mowing in the backyard. And Evelyn had watched him curiously on the back of his tractor mower, thinking what the hell was all that about? Her husband could be so outrageous at times. Evelyn had thought no more of the matter until 2 weeks later, when she'd learnt that the Bullaways had filed for divorce, and everyone at church was naturally very shocked. "I thought they were so happy," people at church would speculate. "They're the last people in the world I'd ever envisage getting divorced. And now this happens. Is there hope for the rest of us? It's such a dreadful pity." Over the years, Evelyn had learnt that her husband was remarkably intuitive and perceptive, and her mother thought that Errol might have extrasensory perception, whatever that was. "I'm telling you, love," Mrs. Collingstoke had told Evelyn, "your Errol's a very special man. He's got the gift. I can see it." "Oh, goodness gracious me, Mum, what are you talking about?" Evelyn had chortled. "What do you mean he's got the gift? You're talking nonsense. I'll have you know that husband of mine has a long nose, that he puts into everybody's business. That's the only gift he's got," she had chuckled. "I don't think so, Evelyn. I think your husband might actually be psychic." "Oh, I don't think he's psychic, Mum. But I do think he's observant. He notices things. There is a big difference, you know. But then nosy people do notice things, don't they? They notice how much you spend on the groceries, and if you've changed your hairstyle. Errol noticed all these details about me. But psychic he is definitely not. But he's very good at reading human behaviour. And you don't have to be psychic for that." These days, if Errol told Evelyn he knew someone was getting divorced, she was inclined to believe him, as over and over again her impossible husband had always been proved right. The kitchen blind had been loosely rolled up this morning, to let in a reluctant, rather wary morning light on the sombre, overcast, grim day, where the grey clouds clustered together like a funeral gathering of lugubriously sorrowful mourners. Evelyn knew that the day would likely remain very cold, if it continued to look as gloomy as this. The weather forecast made for disheartening reading, almost as if the sun herself had decided to take the rest of the year off and go into early hibernation, much like the squirrels and raccoons so obviously had done. Many people would describe the day as depressingly oppressive, rather dull. But Evelyn appreciated the beauty of it all. She loved witnessing the changing of the seasons, and autumn had always been her favourite time of the year, especially when the tall lofty trees burst into a kaleidoscope of gorgeous golds, reds and yellows. Of late most had shed their leaves prematurely, so that the street was littered with a confetti of golden leaves, which really did look rather beguiling to the casual observer, at least the person who wasn't put in the unfortunate position of having to sweep them all up. These verdant landmarks, lofty, tall and proud, looked forlorn and forsaken, their naked boughs stripped of their autumn finery, were begging to be coated with the first snowfall, so that once again they could regain their modesty. Evelyn noticed in recent years that she had become less tolerant of the cold, and wondered if this was an age-related thing. She was sure it was. Errol's fancy binoculars continued to remain stoically pinned on the stately-looking property across the road that was called the Prt1of residence. Evelyn had personally hand-selected and purchased him those binoculars 2 Christmases ago, as he had expressed a keen interest in watching birds. "I think I should take up bird-watching, love," he had told her. "We live in such a lovely rural area, don't we? Here in the Bluegrass State. There are many unusual, magnificent birds that visit our yard all the time. I don't even think I know their names. I would like to become more educated in the matter. I want to learn everything there is to know about them. Even when I take a casual stroll in the woodgrove, I've spotted some interesting birds high up in the branches of those trees that I would personally like to document. I was thinking it would be an enjoyable hobby or pastime to engage in. They always say that when you retire, you need to keep yourself busy by developing new interests. Otherwise, you'll be inclined to boredom with all the extra time on your hands. What do you think, love?" Evelyn had been surprised. "You bored? Never," she chuckled. She never thought that her husband would ever be inclined to express an interest in birds, but she was pleased he was looking to explore other potential hobbies, and knew that her husband's sudden enigmatic interest in birds should be actively encouraged. She had raised a rather sceptical brow. "Well, if it tickles your fancy, love, then you have my blessing. But you've never struck me well as the type of person that would be interested in birds. You were always irritated, weren't you, with that parrot at the pet shop, that African grey? Don't you remember it? It belonged to Mr. Barton, who owned the store in town in 1983. before he and his family relocated to Iowa. Now that was one hell of a noisy bird. Now what was his name again? Capsicum, that's right, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's the name of a pepper, you know. You mark my words, that bird is still alive today. They can live past 100, you know. I was only irritated with Mr. Barton's African grey, because he kept repeating the same damn things over and over again. Polly put the kettle on, and the grand old Duke of York had 10,000 men. Imagine listening to that all day. It would drive me completely bonkers. But not all birds are created equal, love. I've seen some feathery beauties out there in our yard, but I'm going to need a decent pair of binoculars to engage in that sport more professionally. Those old binoculars that belong to your father should be put out to pasture. I can't see a thing through them. I think I would describe them as ancient. They belong in a museum of antiques. Well, they are old, love. I'm actually surprised they even work. Evelyn had privately decided that Errol wanted to watch birds, and if that was the case, he needed a specialized pair of binoculars to enjoy the sport. She would be the one to purchase them for him. She had done so at great length to seek out the perfect pair for him, along with a bird book of North American birds that was the quintessential tool for any aspiring bird watcher. Regretfully, the bird book remained untouched, but the binoculars had been lovingly used every single day for 2 entire years, without exception. But the only birds Errol appeared to be watching were of the human kind, minus all their feathers, along with a masterful ability to fly, as there were no witches on broomsticks flying around the neighbourhood. Errol seemed to take pleasure in watching the comings and goings of the people living in Sunnyvale Close. He knew, for example, that Mrs. Raintree, 2 doors down, went shopping every Thursday and Saturday, and her daughter would visit her every Tuesday morning at about 10:30 like clockwork. These supercilious facts Evelyn did not find remotely interesting, but Errol did. Errol knew that Mrs. Astor, 5 doors down, took her dog into the woodgrove for a walk every afternoon at 3:30 to be precise, and her little white dog, a poodle mix called Clover, would lift his leg on one particular rose bush, without exception, before taking the brisk walk down the public footpath. Despite all these minor insignificant observations that Evelyn felt did not matter at all, Errol appeared most interested in the large patchouli residence on the opposite side of the street, that seemed to be the source of great interest to her husband, as by all accounts there was always some kind of drama unfolding outside the residence, an unnatural amount of activity that always seemed to be centred around the people living in apartment number 5. Errol had seen screaming fire engines, police cars with flashing blue lights and sirens, plumbers and dog grooming services going to apartment number 5, and always being shooed away by the bewildered occupants. The Simpsons, who lived in apartment number 5, seemed to look completely confounded by all these unwanted callers who would arrive fortuitously at their premises, delivering them pizzas that they had never ordered. Emergency workers would leave, grimly shaking their heads in frustration, almost as if they'd been called out on a fool's errand to the residence yet again. Errol Spicer could only conclude that some nasty prankster was behind all this, and was obviously doing a number on the occupants of apartment number 5, toying with them like a cat with a mouse. The Spicers lived in an old 1920s home in a prepossessing green leafy Kentucky neighbourhood, circumnavigated by lofty resplendent woodgroves of trees, and many indulgent hiking trails and footpaths that the couple had industriously explored over the years, usually on the back of their ATVs, with their children, sometimes by foot, and less occasionally on horseback. The most popular walking trail ran directly through the left-hand side of the Patchouli residence and stretched back for miles into fabulous trails. When the Spicers had first moved to Sunnyvale Close in 1962, after their 2 boys Edward and Heath had been born, they believed that this was the idyllic neighbourhood to raise their family. They had moved into a recently renovated, beautiful 1920s home, and together as a loving family had created so many nostalgic memories. The couple's children, of course, had long since grown up and left home over 37 years ago, and both the couple's boys ran an accountancy business, living close to their parents in Lexington. Both now had grown-up kids of their own. When the Spicers arrived in Sunnyvale Close, they had loved this rural, prepossessing neighborhood, and had been concerned that in time many of their spectacular wood groves of trees that stretched behind the Patchouli residence would be chopped down to make way for the building of new homes in the area. But none of that had happened, and thank God for that. The land remained protected from development as a heritage site, which was a real blessing for all the residents of Sunnyvale Close, as it meant their neck of the woods would be preserved indefinitely. Evelyn Spicer inwardly grimaced. She studied her husband with his binoculars eagerly entwined in his hands, his steely grey eyes focused on the street, rather like a ship's captain, casting his gaze out across the ocean, as if looking out for any unwelcome surprises. A pirate ship, perhaps, that imposed a threat. Evelyn smiled as she tried to imagine this playful, fictitious scenario playing out in real life. Her husband would have made an excellent ship's captain, she thought. He'd likely have spotted a pirate ship long before those pirates had a chance to steal all his cargo on board his ship, as her husband noticed everything, although by the looks of things he conveniently hadn't noticed Evelyn this morning, even though she'd addressed him twice already. Or did he know she was there and was conveniently pretending not to hear her, as he was enjoying the view behind his binoculars far too much, and acknowledging her would disrupt his attention? "Sweetheart," she repeated for the third time, this time raising her voice. "What are you up to, love? What are you looking at? Please don't tell me you've fixed on the Patchouli residence yet again. Has the fire brigade been called out on a fool's errand?" "No, nothing like that," said Errol. "But there is more drama unfolding before my very eyes," he said, pointing towards the Patchouli residence through the glass pane of their window. "You won't believe what I've just seen, love. I tell you, Evelyn, who needs daytime television when you've got a street like ours with so many curiously interesting residents? What's wrong with you, Errol? Haven't you got anything better to do with your time than spy on our neighbours? So much for all this so-called bird watching you were supposed to be getting into. I don't think you've even opened that bird book I bought you on North American birds. I think the only birds you've ever intended watching are of the human kind. But you never wanted to admit that to me, did you? When I bought you those binoculars, I specially got them for watching birds, not people. I hate to say this to you, Errol, but you're becoming quite the snoop. I'm getting concerned by your incessant spying on people. It's not normal, you know. You're not the Gestapo, are you? If people were to find out about this extracurricular pastime of yours, you would likely ruffle many feathers around here. Let me tell you, people don't take kindly to being watched all the time. If I knew our next-door neighbour was spying on me, I'd probably want to throttle the man. Well, good job he's not spying on you, then. I can assure you of that, love," said Errol, his eyes twinkling mischievously. The Patchouli residence was a large, imposing residential home that was built in the 1920s that belonged to our highly esteemed ship's captain, who was believed to have sired over 15 children, with his wife Patchouli. The captain had commissioned a large house to be built for his sizable family, and because his wife was called Patchouli, he named the place after her. It was said that days before he returned home from a voyage out at sea, his wife would be standing at the window, watching and waiting for any sign of her husband's return, for she could never be sure on the day he'd arrive back. The couple loved the bones of each other, and she missed his long absences away from home. When he did return from weeks spent away, his wife would run out of the house, throwing her arms around him, followed by 15 excitable children, all delighted to see their father again. They were the 1800s equivalent of the Brady Bunch. In 1952, the remarkable, stunning-looking double-storey dwelling had been converted into 6 very stylish individual apartments. 3 apartments side by side were located on the 2nd floor, and 3 apartments on the ground floor, all part of the original Prt1of residence. Over the years, the Spicers had often kept parcels for the occupants of the Prt1of residence, and anyone else for that matter, living in Sunnyvale Close. As being retired, one of them was usually at home, so the postman, Bart Tenderloin, knew he could trust the Spicers to look after the parcels, so that locals could pick up their parcels from the Spicers at their earliest convenience. The Spicers were pillars of the community, well liked in the neighbourhood, and Mrs. Spicer would like to keep it that way, so she didn't want anyone to find out about her husband Errol's new pastime.
"I'm not a snoop," said Errol. "I'm an interested observer, my love. That's all this is. There's no harm at all in watching the goings-on in the street. I'm just like a CCTV camera, that's all. It would be doing exactly the same thing. If you must know, right now I'm watching the estate agent this morning. You know the woman, the one with the blonde hair. I think her name's Mrs. Dobson. I suspect she's about 43 years old at a guess. But she definitely thinks she's still 20, judging by the way she's dressed. She's always wearing leopard print skirts that cling to her so tightly like a second skin, and high-heel shoes that she can barely even walk in, with heels that get locked in the grass. Look at her tottering around the place in those high heels. She looks utterly ridiculous. She's just put up a for sale sign yet again in the front yard of the Prt1of residence. She's standing there on the street, talking on her cell phone again, shaking her head all the time. She looks completely bewildered, if you ask me. I guess it's because she's been asked to sell apartment number 5 all over again, which she only did 6 months earlier. I saw the Simpsons packing up their things yesterday, love. I never told you about this. But they did. They packed them in a removal van. Mrs. Simpson looked heartily relieved to be leaving the residence. They got into their car and hightailed it out of here, without saying goodbye to anyone, as if they couldn't get away from this place fast enough. Almost as if living in apartment number 5 had become a living nightmare for them. And judging by all the hoaxes being played on their behalf, I can't say I'm remotely surprised that they've made a run for it. I remember we met the Simpsons briefly, love, when they picked up a parcel from us. They told us they were very excited to move into the Prt1of residence. They had found their dream apartment, and now they're selling up, and have already left even before they've sold the place. You mark my words, there's something off with apartment number 5, and it's not just those hoax phone calls. I'd like to find out exactly what it is. I'm most curious about the matter. To all intensive purposes, the Simpsons moved into that apartment with a full intention of laying down roots for themselves, and now they fleed from the place at the first and earliest opportunity. It's more than a little bizarre, don't you think, love?
Oh, I do. And it's dreadfully sad. They were such a lovely couple, weren't they? If I remember correctly, they were saying they'd fallen head over heels in love with that apartment. They intended to raise their children there. Now they're moving away. It makes no sense at all. Surely they'd not be leaving on account of all those hoax calls that they never made themselves. None of it was their fault. They didn't call the fire brigade or the police, did they? No, they didn't. But those calls must have been absolutely infuriating, Errol agreed. But maybe they got tired of being a victim to those hoaxes. Ostensibly in the last 2 years, over 4 couples have lived at number 5, and then sold up just like that, and left in an awful hurry, just like the Simpsons have done. It's become a regular pattern, has it not? From all my observations, they couldn't get away fast enough, and even the estate agent looks a little rattled, as if she cannot for the life of her fathom what the hell is going on. I don't know why she's complaining. She's got a stunning apartment on her books to sell again. That means more commission for her,
and those apartments sell like hotcakes, from what I've seen. So she'll be laughing all the way to the bank, won't she?"
Evelyn thought about her husband's words for a brief moment.
"Well, I'm sure, love, there's an innocent explanation as to why the Simpsons are leaving so suddenly. Surely it can't be all to do with those hoaxes. There must be more going on. In my experience, there usually is. You never know. Maybe Mr. Simpson got a job, a transfer perhaps, far away from the bluegrass state. So the couple were forced to sell up and leave. I guess there'll be new people now moving into the apartment. It is an awful pity. I did like the Simpsons very much. Such an amenable couple they were. I understand all the apartments in the Patchouli apartment block are very luxurious, very stylish. So as you say, it'll be snapped up in the blink of an eye. I mean, it's a stunning 1920s building that, much like our own property, has been superbly restored and renovated. What is there not to like about the place? Our two properties are prime example of 1920 residences, and I, for one, am very proud of our place."
Evelyn was not wrong, as in what seemed like a couple of weeks, apartment number 5 was now occupied by a young couple called Mr. and Mrs. Knoxville. She had heard from one of her neighbours that they came from Albuquerque, New Mexico. So there we are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night.